My name is Michael Valentin. I work in a foreign language department, modern and classical classical languages and literature. It's not foreign anymore. Okay, so change the name. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the March lecture, present lecture series. As you know, perhaps you don't know, so I will remind you very quickly. Don't worry, I won't speak too long. Since we are relatively isolated, for good or bad reasons, it has its advantages. The president of the University of Montana, 19 years ago, decided to start a series of presidential lecture series conference. And the purpose was, and will be to invite main speakers, internationally speaking, at all levels, to come to the University of Montana and entertain you with key ideas, key problems. So we should thank and be thankful to the University of Montana President George Denison and his faithful second in command as far as the President Lecture Series is concerned, which is Professor Drake. Thank you. Bravo. Professor Wladimir Krysinski is first a Polish citizen extraordinaire, it's a French word, from Poland, like Eastern Europe. And this is no Polish joke, please. He has a tradition, Eastern Europe has a tradition of producing high-level intellectuals and artists. 2, Professor Wladimir Krysinski is a Canadian citizen teaching at the University of Montreal in Francophone Quebec, you all heard about it, and living in Anglophone Ottawa, a few 100 miles away. 3, is a world citizen who speaks or reads 12 languages and has taught, lectured, and traveled all over the world. 4, and last but not least, is an eminent representative of the World Republic of Letters, an impressive specialist of the globalization of literature, which started before the letter a long time ago, as he's going to explain to us tonight. Professor Krysinski obtained an MA in Polish literature at the University of Łódź, LBODZ, in Poland, of course. In 1956, with a thesis on the poetry of Jaroslaw Iwaszkiewicz, especially the work that Iwaszkiewicz did between 1919 and 1934. Then he carried on with a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Strasbourg. You know, Strasbourg on this zone of friction. It's not friction anymore between German culture and Latin culture in France. In 1966, with a thesis on the thematic structures in Pirandello, Italian playwright, André Gide, famous writers in the 30s, Lenormand, Michel de Gelderode, who is a playwright from Belgium, Jean-Paul Sartre, you all know Jean-Paul Sartre, and Jean Genet, who is a writer who did most of his writing in jail. So theater, literature, novel, new novel, different countries, you have the picture, right? His endless list of books, publications, and articles in Italian, French, English, and Spanish would cause the face of many Sorbonnard Mandarin, Yale or Harvard pundits, or Oxford dons turn green with envy. Professor Krysinski's career, teaching fields, and expertise cover the French, Polish, Russian, Italian, Spanish, Canadian, American, and Latin American literature and fine arts of the 18th, 19th, 20th century, as well as modern and postmodern theater and literary theory. Like the negative floating signifiers, bastards, métis, mongrels, mutants, unorthodox, nomad, vagrant, is world literature an example of what belongs nowhere or has no essence? Or do the multi-dimension of world literature, woven into quotations, reference, echoes, borrowings from highbrow and lowbrow cultures from different places in the world pave the way for the literature of tomorrow? Many Europeans fear transgenic plants. Many environmentalists decry invasive species. Many hardcore regionalists resent tourists, foreigners, or Californians. Is the international hybrid text a new form of literature where too much promiscuity destroys singularity and originality? The way American pop culture displaces native culture, where everything becomes equal and loses its true essence of meaning, place, and reality? Or is the hybrid text our only salvation against the deculturation accomplished by a capital globalization gone rampant, frenzic, mad? With the postmodern new twist that the change of human things has taken, the mixed product of sexual and cultural intercourses represent the avant-garde of our future. To one degree or the other, we're all transgenics, métis, hybrids, quasimodos. With tonight's topic, Rethinking World Literature from Goethe's idea to Harold Bloom's The Western Canon, Professor Krysinski and the World Republic of Letters salute Missoula, the so-called last best place. Please help me welcome Professor Krysinski.
It was too beautiful to be true. So many superlatives. And what tone should I elect now to speak after this moving, for me at least, presentation? So perhaps I would like from the outset to thank in absentia President Denison. I met him in May 2004 in France, in Lyon, and after a short conversation, he asked me whether I would envisage coming to the University of Montana to deliver the President's Service Lecture. I was struck by President's spontaneity and humanity. I almost spontaneously accepted that invitation. It further materialized by my correspondence with Professor Michel Valentin, whom I kindly thank for everything he has done to organize my coming to Missoula. I also want to thank Miss Kathleen Collins for her efficient assistance in making my travel to Missoula possible. I would also like to thank all the colleagues whom I met this week at the University of Montana. My lecture will be an attempt to better understand world literature. I do not guarantee that the result will be positive, but you will see it. So my topic was formulated like as Rethinking World Literature from Goethe to Harold Bloom's Western Canon. And to start with, I would like to sketch highlights of the problem, because you should know that this story is not so old. It took place in 1827. It was a Wednesday, 31st of January, and the greatest German poet, Jan Wolfgang Goethe, is 77, and he is an old young man, extremely energetic, intellectually active, and he has an admirer who, to some extent, could be defined, described as his secretary. His name is Eckermann, bad poet, disent le mauvaise langue. Anyway, what happens is that 31st of January 1827, Goethe communicates to Eckermann his famous idea, world literature, Weltliteratur. I will not quote it in German. I propose the following translation. Presently, says Goethe, national literature does not mean much. The era of world literature is coming, and everyone has to commit herself or himself to accelerate it. No definition of Weltliteratur is given. Instead, it is an intuition. Nevertheless, we can speculate on Goethe's intentional meaning. The term may mean literature of the world, in which case the relationship between an owner and a property is strongly underlined. Humanity is the owner and the property, world literature, belongs to it. In Goethe's affirmation, there is an element of tautology. World literature stems from the world in its totality, and it belongs to the world seen as a global cosmos. If such literature can be imagined, we should say that its existence is imaginary. This leads to the assumption that there is an audience capable of reading world literature understood in this way. Another meaning that we can give to Goethe's notion may be as follows. World literature is composed of smaller unities and, in the first place, national literatures. Fine, but any national literature must contain elements which we can define as universal. The great American writer William Faulkner is a good case in point. The plots of his novels take place in a county that he invented, but he creates at the same time a sort of mythological or biblical background by which his characters enter a universal perspective and demonstrate constant elements of the human condition beyond the boundaries of any specific province. As a matter of fact, world literature distinguishes itself from national literatures by something that comes from them. World literature is thus both a prophecy and a project of constituting a universal museum of all national literatures. A third possible meaning of world literature can be described as various translations of selected works, presumably masterpieces, in a limited number of representative languages, which by metonymy may represent the whole world. Consequently, we can propose that such languages as English, Chinese, Hindi, Urdu, Arabic, Spanish, Russian, and Japanese constitute a translated unity that represents world literature. The shortcoming of this type of operation resides in the fact that a work written, for example, in Croatian and translated into all the above mentioned languages could not be read by someone who does not have a command of one of these 8 languages. Notwithstanding those circumstances, one has to admit that translation is a basic dynamic factor for the promotion of world literature. It would be inconceivable without translation. Actually, in Germany, the expression world literature, Weltliteratur, is often used in the everyday language of newspapers, where it signifies any literary work which, after having attained sufficient recognition in the country where it was written, has been translated into German. We can say that in Germany, the books by such contemporary American writers as Crichton and Dan Brown belong to world literature because they have been translated into German. Such is not the case of other countries where prose and poetry that have been translated do not almost automatically get the label world literature. Our semantic game could be played endlessly without finding a convincing argument in favor of any single meaning. The conclusion from what we have shown so far could be the following. World literature is above all a qualitative notion. It refers to what is representative in terms of recognition and in terms of commonly acknowledged values. Because, to put it bluntly, world literature is about recognition. How then can one identify world literature by eliminating national literatures? Here we approach the global space in which the national and the universal, the local and the global coexist. There are situations when what is local and national define themselves passionately against a planetary system of values. There are writers who prefer to remain all their life in the same place, and they speak only about that place. I remember that during one of my travels to Latin America, I met a poet in Argentina. He recited some poems from his book entitled "The Poet Sings His Small Place." El poeta canta su pequeño país. World literature is not only Goethe's brilliant and timely pronouncement. It arose from the surrounding historical circumstances and from Goethe's rejection of national literature, a notion which he felt had to no relevance whatsoever at that historical moment. To examine the issue of world literature in its historical perspective, I suggest we do the following. A, we analyze the situation in the first half of the 19th century in an attempt to understand Goethe's strong opposition between national literatures and world literatures. B, we review the importance of national literatures as testified by objective historical facts. In this regard, I would like to quote the Italian philosopher and historian Benedetto Croce, who wrote that in the 19th century, freedom was a dominant religion. This specifically applies to the European and Latin American context. In such countries as Russia, Germany, Poland, Italy, Argentina, and Venezuela, many historical movements and uprisings confirm the importance of national literatures. Here are a few examples. In Russia, such philosophers and critics as Chernyshevsky, Belinsky, Dobrolyubov have debated about some writers and works and raised numerous questions concerning the why and how of Russian literature. One of the most important literary documents of the time is Belinsky's letter to Gogol. It dates from 1842, and its main argument is Gogol's vision of the Russian people. Belinsky criticizes Gogol's way of representing Russians in his comedy The Inspector General and in his novel The Dead Souls. Belinsky strongly opposes Gogol's vision of the Russians inasmuch as he represents them as a very religious people. Belinsky disagrees with that image and claims the following: the Russian people are different. Mystic exaltation is not in their nature. They have too much common sense, too lucid and positive a mind, and therein perhaps lies the vastness of their historic destinies in the future. Religiousness has not even taken root among the clergy, since a few isolated and exceptional personalities distinguished for such cold ascetic contemplation prove nothing. But the majority of our clergy has always been distinguished for their fat bellies, scholastic pedantry, and savage ignorance. Religiosity among us appeared only in the schismatic sects who formed such a contrast in spirit to the mass of the people and who were numerically so insignificant in comparison with it. National literature is about nation. It relies on its history, language, culture. It invests into literary representation of a nation. In the 19th century, national literatures flourished since their emergence was strongly linked to the history of many new or already established states. For the above-mentioned critics, the main issue was to define what was or what should be specifically Russian in literature. Many texts on Russian literature exhibit this trend of ideological literary criticism. It is deeply rooted in the notion of Russian identity. This is an issue frequently raised by the critics. At the same time, the Russian intellectual stage and ideological debates are propelled by an opposition between two parties, two visions of the world, the Slavophiles and the Occidentalists. Dostoevsky represents the Slavophiles and Turgenev the Occidentalists. The debate between them reveals two visions of Russia. For the Slavophile, the homeland is a traditionally established, mainly rural community with its system of values and with good old Russian virtues. For the Occidentalist, it is an underdeveloped country which should be significantly reformed, and the reforms may or actually should come from the West. It is well-known fact that both Dostoevsky and Turgenev loved their homeland, but as a Slavophile, Dostoevsky hated Western civilization and expressed his feelings in many texts. Turgenev was deeply involved in the process of improving Russian political standards, but it was a hopeless case. He did not succeed in imposing necessary reforms. I could quote many other examples of discussions and debates about the form and the thematic nature of various national literatures. I should mention that Poland, Italy, Germany, and Hungary have had their defenders and prophets as far as the national identities of their literatures are concerned. For the sake of my argument, I would like to make another observation. in terms of world literature, understood as a representative set of literary works stemming from different national literatures, the debates and attempts to define them have led to a particular state of affairs. It is the current state of affairs that which is national in literature must precede that which is universal. As a matter of fact, world literature, as it may be understood after Goethe, is by no means a uniform textual body separated from national literatures. Instead, it is a double-sided textual structure with both national and universal dimensions. The question which remains is the following. What determines the fact that some national literary works will never belong to world literature? And how is it that a number of works, once translated, will immediately enter a specific canon and by the same token become universal paradigms of world literature? I feel that to answer these questions, we need to reflect further and try to balance these two literary realities, national and universal. Types of critical reading and interpreting vary considerably for any given literature. In fact, comparative literature is both the source and target of the variety of interpretations. It gives way to and stems from the comparing literatures. Any comparison implies a dialectic between what is compared, what is comparable, and the person who has been comparing. This dialectic presupposes partial and tendentious critical devices used as selected wholes. Comparing literatures is quite an old process, but in the 19th century it acquired some specific elements. All the debates and discussions to which I have alluded were based on a holistic approach to such phenomena as literature, movement, tendency, work, or series of works. The holistic visions of literature arise from the multiplication of the specific wholes or sets, and putting together various wholes means establishing a comparative process. Examples of such wholes are well known: Slavic literatures, Italian literature, Czech literature, American literature, Black American literature, colonial literature, post-colonial literature. You probably are aware that in 1948, the German Romanist and theorist of literature Ernst Robert Curtius published a book entitled European Literature and Latin Middle Ages. That whole, established by Curtius, is limited. It encompasses the Christian, Latin European civilization and the main Romance languages, but also German. Almost 50 years later, the Czech novelist and essayist Milan Kundera would draw our attention to another European whole. It is called Central Europe and has a well-established and commonly used German term, Mitteleuropa. Here we are entering a semiotic sphere underlined by preferential behavior. We will see that comparing literatures cannot avoid formulating value judgments. The basis of these value judgments may be surprising, but also convincing. In the history of modern literary criticism, there are cases of critics who have proven to be tendentiously disposed to some phenomena characterizing different national literatures, understood and interpreted as wholes. In fact, an obvious general trend in modern theory will be the multiplication and even invention of specific terms and concepts in order to differentiate among literatures. Georg Brandes provides a very interesting example. This Danish critic, and one of the first European comparatists, has had many merits in his critical dealings. He is probably the first European critic who approached various European literatures holistically, as wholes. At the same time, he did have a profound understanding of European culture and explained it not as a homogeneous whole. Along with some other critics, he highlighted the fact that without comparisons, we cannot have a clear and relevant image of any literature or any literary work under analysis. And his philosophy of comparison is based on the conviction that what should be demonstrated by any comparatist is the singularity of what is under comparison. And that singularity is an identity taken as the uniqueness of a given compared object, phenomenon, or work. I am going to add a few words here about a well-known and famous text by Brandes. In 1871, he was offered the chair of comparative literature at the University of Copenhagen. On that occasion, he gave a speech now called the Inaugural Lecture 1871. What characterizes Brandes' way of comparing literature is a strong conviction that a tertium comparationis must have a solid grounding in a system of values. In his inaugural lecture, that system of values is the French Revolution. Brandes formulates the subject of his study carefully. First, he will deal with the reaction against the literature of the 18th century during the first decade of the 19th and the triumph of this reaction. In order to do so, he reminds us what comparative literature is. It brings literatures closer together. They become closer to us. Comparative literature does not privilege just one perspective. For Brandes, a scientific approach to literature must be comparative. In dealing with the reaction against the literature of the 18th century, he distinguishes between old and complete literatures and the literatures which are not complete and too limited in their way of showing the life of people. Brandes criticizes Danish literature harshly because it has not reacted against the literature of the 18th century. It was a rather artificial literature, far removed from the Danish people. Overall, the lesson of Brandes may be defined as follows. Literatures are different in terms of their tradition, their political and social commitment, and in terms of recognition. By praising English and French literatures, Brandes established a hierarchy of literatures. They may be part of world literature under the condition that it clearly expresses its preferential ideas, forms, themes, etc. The dialectic between world literature and any national literature should lies in between what is local and what is universal. The numerous interpretations of world literature, all the opinions, definitions, and judgments, selectively established textual bodies of the works that constitute world literature at the expense of some other works. Among those interpretations, you find either a positive attitude towards world literature or recognition that it is a dream. From the many texts dedicated to the topic, two come to mind immediately, that of the Italian comparatist and Germanist Arturo Farinelli, and that of Erich Auerbach. Farinelli wrote an essay, Il sogno di una letteratura mondiale. He underlines the fact that Goethe's idea is an abstraction rather than a reality. It is a Germanic product. World literature is seen as a representative repertoire of literary works and masterpieces from the entire world cannot be taken for granted. It is a phenomenon to be thought of mythically. As a representative literature, recognized as such, as an accord of the universe, world literature, la letteratura mondiale, is a dream, and as such, it is a chimera. In 1952, the great German critic Erich Auerbach wrote an essay called Philology of World Literature. For Auerbach, world literature is actually a program, a reconstruction of the state of affairs which concerns the whole human civilization. It is also a study of diversity, an object which is philological and as such must be studied collectively. It is also an aesthetic reality, and as such it has to be experienced by different cultural audiences. Auerbach warns against the danger of global standardization and sees the danger in a possible imposition of European and American models as well as the totalitarian Soviet model. He wrote this essay just a year before Stalin's death. For Auerbach, ideologies are therefore enemies of world literature. He promotes world literature as a possibility to discover diversity as a basic and noble feature of the human world. Undoubtedly, the Western canon by Harold Bloom is one of the most fascinating examples of some critical operations designed to help us understand the critic's way of seeing Western literature, its tradition, its presence throughout history, and its system of values. What I call critical operations are canon formation, definition of literary specific objects, establishment of lists of canonic Western writers. First, let me say that the reader of the Western canon comes face to face with a pyramidal and polystructural picture. This means that literary greatness is easier grasped geometrically by occupying a given place within a pyramid. The pyramid is a canon whose topography is clearly established by Bloom. He easily crosses the words of the great writers. He succeeds in reconstructing the center where he places Shakespeare, and Whitman is at the center of the American canon. Bloom teaches us how to read and how to become a conscious and well-informed reader. Why? Because he speaks in a unique way of Dante, Shakespeare, Whitman, and so many other writers. Two quotations from Bloom. First about Shakespeare and Dante. Shakespeare and Dante are the center of the canon because they excel all other Western writers in cognitive acuity, linguistic energy, and power of invention. The second quotation is about Walt Whitman. Before reading it, I would like to emphasize my deep conviction. Bloom's book is about America, about its tradition, its system of values. The Western Canon is a book on American national literature. Now the quote. The Jesus of the American religion is neither the crucified man nor the God of ascension, but rather the resurrected man who passes 40 days with the disciples, 40 days about which the New Testament tells us virtually nothing. Bloom's reading process is based on the assumption that the canons have always had an important function in any literature. Bloom gives the following definition of the canon. The canon, a word religious in its origins, has become a choice among texts struggling with one another for survival, whether you interpret the choice as being made by dominant social groups, institutions of education, traditions of criticism, or, as I do, by late-coming authors who feel themselves chosen by particular ancestral figures. I see the great value of the Western canon in the possibility of educating both young and old people. This book is rightly subtitled The Books and School of the Ages. The educational function of Bloom's book resides in the understanding of a hierarchical vision of literature. That vision is always clearly described and presented in terms of a value system. The author is remarkably informed and successfully creates his own visions of great writers. Harold Bloom's position toward word literature is not directly given. However, his impressive book is a valid contribution to the understanding and practice of word literature. Since any internationally posited canonic literature is a word literature, we should recognize that the Western canon, such as it is understood and thoroughly explained by Harold Bloom, belongs to the global family of humankind. And in that family, there are a multitude of canons, ways of reading, and of interpreting literature and literatures. Another important element which should be emphasized is Bloom's successful effort to link the Western canon to the literary Western tradition, to the history of literature, and to the collective memory of the West. Let's remember that the term canon is of Greek origin. Although it initially meant rule or principle, it has successively acquired a religious and theological meaning. Canonization is a theological process which presupposes the choice and acceptance of a person who will or will not be canonized. In that process, important roles are played by an advocatus Dei and by an advocatus Diaboli. The first one is in favor of canonization. The other is against. Bloom is both an advocatus Dei and a devil's advocate. He is the only judge and the only brilliant, albeit controversial, reader. If his book may be recognized as too traditional, not completely open to the changing world, strongly polemical against what he calls the school of resentment, that is to say feminist, Marxist, Lacanians, new historicists, deconstructionists, and semioticians, it will remain a monumental vision of Western literature. Bloom's book is monumental too because it relies on the classics, on a reading of the works, but also on the historical circumstances, as well as on the intellectual, cognitive, and aesthetic dimension of the reading process. Thus, understood, the Western canon throws a new light on what Goethe called Weltliteratur. Just how topical and relevant is this issue in the present context of globalization? The new notion of Weltliteratur, or world literature, is better suited to the new historical and literary circumstances. There is a strong tendency to link cultural facts and events to globalization. Let's make a short list. Cross-cultural communication, economy, bestsellers, confusion between commercial success of any cultural product and its intrinsic value. These phenomena constitute a new cultural context in which debates and discussions about world literature take place. In this sense, world literature is no longer a representative set of works, recognized as such because of the promotion of certain values, for example, the topicality and originality of the literary vision, literary representation, such as in Salman Rushdie's writings, or the aesthetic function of literature. Here, a good example could be a great French writer, Claude Simon, or the mythological vision as in Joyce's Ulysses, or Hermann Broch's The Death of Virgil. Nowadays, world literature has changed and attained a new literary perspective. A singular understanding of world literature comes from an affirmation that world literature threatens the French literary stage. In that cultural context, world literature acquires the new following meanings. World literature is constituted by the, I quote, by the big American machines, Michael Crichton, John Grisham, Stephen King, and as a French editor, Teresa Cremisi notes, quote, world literature is popular literature of quality which represents an equivalent of American cinema and which at the cinema works with the same universal keys. Popular literature has always crossed boundaries. We should recognize the fact that nowadays Americans are the only ones who have the recipe for it. In this swirl of meanings, there is also recognition that world literature is mainly expressed in English. There are books written in different languages, and they will be translated into English almost immediately. The bestsellers of Umberto Eco and Paulo Coelho are good examples. This situation makes us realize that some of the biggest publishing houses exercise a sort of dictatorship because they impose their authors. The reality of various book markets and exhibitions is that they are showcasing the international triumphs of a few writers as promoted by their publishers. This also may be called, and indeed it was called, world literature. In 2003, the American comparative David Damrosch published an important work on world literature with the modest title, What is World Literature? Damrosch proposes quite a new and relevant understanding of the concept. While distinguishing three meanings, Damrosch insists on the following, quote, world literature is writing that gains in translation. World literature is writing that gains in translation. For the critic, the most important thing seems to be, quote, the mode of circulation and of reading books that crossed different boundaries. I draw the following conclusion from Damrosch's analysis. First, there are many different world literatures. They exist and are embodied in different words and in different languages. They do not necessarily communicate between themselves. Second, I do not think that gaining in translation can be an absolutely valid criterion for recognizing a work as belonging to world literature. There are bad translations of great works. What happens then to the original text? Are they condemned to have only national recognition, even though their visions and narratives are universal? My last remarks will be following. From Goethe to Harold Bloom, little has changed in the field of world literature if we look at it from the strictly literary point of view. It always was a symbolic crossroad of masterpieces. It could not abandon national literatures completely, and national literatures are always struggling for recognition and for an identity. We are now witnessing the battle of the canons, but also the decanonizations, recanonizations, and the creation of new canons. I said that the Western canon is also a book about America. However, it does not include enough Black American writers who have contributed and continue contributed to the diversity of the American canon. This has been underlined by Toni Morrison in her book, Playing in the Dark. With the fall of the Soviet Union, some of the old national literatures, for example, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, Azerbaijani, or Georgian, have now truly emerged and are struggling for universal recognition. They intend, I suppose, to join world literature. In the context of globalization, the return to Weltliteratur as the initial name for an emerging phenomenon and the return to world literature as a partly commercial use of text is also recognition of the fact that contemporary literary production deserves a universal understanding. It will not be easy, but it deserves a new invention and a new universal language. Thank you.
I'm sure there are a lot of questions. As you know, there's two mics here, right and left, left and right. Or you can speak, if you speak loud from where you are. Go ahead, fire.
Professor Krysinski, I spent a career as a teacher of English literature. And I taught English literature and I taught poetry. And in recent studies of French, I began to look into the question of the translation of what may well be the most influential poem in English on French culture, which is Poe's The Raven. And I came to the conclusion that the poem cannot be translated into French. Its content can be, but the rhythmic quality of the poem cannot be translated into French. Now, the whole question of poetry for me in your talk is very important. If, as Damrosch says, world literature is literature that gains in translation, that means that it doesn't include poetry in my experience.
It doesn't include, it does include.
Does it? Well, because so much of poetry depends upon the physicality of a particular language, as anyone who's tried to translate a poem into another language knows.
So what is the question, Bill?
The question is, does world literature include poetry or only prose translations of poetry?
Well, I quoted some poets without quoting their poetry. Which one? I quoted Dante. I think it's enough, but it was not my purpose, actually. But I agree with you. There are poems which cannot be translated. What is this British English poem?
Pardon me?
What is this English poem which had so strong influence on French culture?
Poe's The Raven, which the talk that I gave involved the fact that the two best French poets who translated The Raven into French, Baudelaire and Mallarmé, translated it into prose.
Yes, yes, of course. But Baudelaire wrote an interesting comment, an interesting analysis of the Raven. Yeah.
What I'm talking about is the bones, the bony structure of the poem, which doesn't get translated. The intellectual content gets translated, but that's not the poem.
So you agree or you don't agree with Damrosch?
I think what he says suggests that poetry must be excluded from world literature.
No, I think it's abusively false interpretation of what I said.
I have a question to launch the debate further. You spoke, the core of your talk is about Harold Bloom, and you know it's very controversial. The Canon has exploded, but we all know the story. So I understand I understand what the core of your argument. In order to have this conversant inter-exchange between different literature, you have to have some guidelines, you have to have a corpus, right? But although, as you said, you mentioned that Bloom excluded a lot of non-Western, non-European literature, like from the Arab, the Persian, and he did a very highly selective cut, right? But even if we want to, and I understand also, as you said, you cannot make good art with, it's not because you suffered, it's not enough. Resentment is not enough. Although I don't know if Bloom is right when he equivocates Marxism, feminism with literature of resentment. That's another perhaps, or perhaps not another perhaps at the core issue. But even though, who in this canon, who is the agency of inclusion? That's one of, Bloom was representative of a certain tradition, the end of that tradition. But I understand we may want to form a new hyper-canon. But who is going to be the agent? Academics? Rightists academics, leftist academics, consensus, you see what I mean? Who's going to form that new looser hyper-canon, if you want?
Well, I think that Bloom does not say clearly who would be this authority, but what is implied in his analysis is certainly the fact that scholars, critics, teachers, professors should play a decisive role in this process. Now, I think that his way of rejecting and of attacking the school of resentment is quite pathetic, but it is a sort of misunderstanding, I think, because all these resentful people have made many, many important things for new literature. So I think here what produces itself is sort of the end of dialogue, you know? But this is an excellent question. Who will judge, who will decide? Because from what I said, perhaps follows the results, an idea that at the very end, after a series of selections, we will attain a level where there will be a few judges, and they will state, this is a masterpiece, this belongs to world literature. This is a quite comic situation, caricatural. So I don't have a solution.
I don't know if this is so much a question, but just a furtherance of discussion. I just read As I Lay Dying by Faulkner, and you mentioned you couldn't think in a way of a more local author than Faulkner, talking about rural people in northern Mississippi. But for some reason, he's become an important part of world literature. And in one of the reading I've been doing recently, they said Faulkner was virtually forgotten. Then Malcolm Cowley in 1946, by his criticism, revived Faulkner. And a few years later, he's won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and now he's a major, I guess maybe one of the major world authors of the 20th century. So it is a curious process of what becomes a part of the canon and doesn't. I'm not quite as sure as this, but it seems like I also read that Melville was virtually forgotten until Edmund Wilson in the 1920s started reviving Moby Dick. So it seems like a very dicey process where you depend upon whether a person is one of the great figures of world literature or is forgotten. That's just an observation rather than a question.
I think it's a good observation. I agree with you. As I Lay Dying is both locally situated plot, and it is universal meaning. It has a universal meaning.
Since you said that translation is essential, to what extent?
The problem, I'm sorry, I will interrupt you, because I would like to see the speakers, you know, and I see just a shadow overshadowed by the shadow. You know?
Tell me when I'm sufficiently spotted. Can you see me?
Yes.
Since you mentioned that translation is crucial for entering world literature, to what extent then do commercial interests have an effect on creating a canon, and how might they skew it?
Is it just one question or two questions?
It is a single question with two components.
Can you repeat the first component and the second component?
Well, you mentioned that translation.
Yes, translation.
Is essential.
Yes.
Translation tends to be a
Yes.
commercial judgment. Whether or not a work gets translated into several languages depends on its probability for being sold profitably. And that's in the judgment of commercial editors. So my question was, to what extent do commercial interests affect what works enter a world canon, and what ways might those commercial interests skew the composition of the canon?
Well, your question is a rhetorical question. So in a way, you answered yourself this question. Of course, the commercial interest is extremely important, and it leads to sort of sometimes subtle or sometimes vulgar manipulation of the text to be translated. For instance, I would say Umberto Eco. Umberto Eco became a great writer. It is not the case of a great Italian writer, Italo Calvino. It is not the case of a great Italian writer, Carlo Emilio Gadda. So there's a sort of confusion, and the system of values is very imprecise, difficult to capture, to understand. But, well, coming back to your rhetorical question, the commercial interest is obvious.
Is it necessarily opposed to artistic quality?
In some cases, it can give good results and it can serve a true literature.
When you were sort of saying that the system or the structure from which someone comes creates a meaning or shapes a meaning, and that Bloom comes out of a very specific context, out of the American context. And I was thinking how any kind of canon creation is sort of an attempt to quantify a qualitative thing, that you're trying to say, here's this value, and I can prove it's important because here are all these writers who are stating this thing. They show how it's important. And I was wondering if the importance isn't so much in the creation of the canon, that we're all going to be creating canons and everyone's going to say this is what's important, but it's more in the work and the critical analysis of the canons, of saying, why did this person create it? Why is this important? And not so much the actual creation.
Yes, I agree with you, but on the other hand, I think that Bloom has done a good work. So he both explained and build a canon. But your way of reasoning about canon is right. I do agree with you.
I'm going to ask it, or again, it's not so much a question, or maybe an observation, but it strikes me as maybe there's two ways, and maybe Faulkner's a good example, two ways of achieving something that does become world literature. And there's a saying in the United States, I don't know if it's in other places, that all politics are local. So I think some authors ground themselves in their locality, like Faulkner, but somehow it transcends the locality and becomes universal. Or there's other authors, maybe like Goethe and Faust, that try and take on the universal topic, for lack of a better reason, or Melville and Moby Dick. So again, there's a magic about literature. Somehow you can go to, and I just was wondering about your thoughts on it, you can go from a very local, specific thing, somehow achieve the universal, or you can take a huge theme, and if you're able to handle it, like say Goethe and Faust, or some other Dante and Divine Comedy. So you can start from the specific and go to the general, or you can start from the general and go to the general, I guess. But you start from very different places, and maybe end up in the same place.
You are right. I think these three attitudes can be verified and in literature. But I would say that what is really problematic and difficult to do is the choice of arguments to show that this is local, but at the same time it is in the process of becoming universal. How to analyze those things, you know. But your description is right, I think. Yes.
Today in the class that I was teaching, which is about ethnicity and nationalism, we were dealing with how culture is often driven by language. And I was using the example of a weak culture which accepts certain individuals.
Of what culture? I didn't.
Weak, or relatively
Weak,
culture.
yes.
And I'm using the example of that if we look at Ukrainian literature, we find it to be rather weak, or at least I do. And I was using the example of, for example, The Cherry Orchard. Works by Chekhov set in Kiev are all written in Russian. Can you name for me in Ukrainian, and if you would go beyond that into several other relatively obscure or emerging languages, works that you regard as deserving to be part of the world literature canon?
I think you quoted a good example. The Ukrainian literature probably is as important, as good and valuable as any Slavic literature. Now, the history of Ukraine was tragic, and the creation of the Soviet Union didn't help. So we don't know this literature. To say that it is weak, of course, perhaps it reflects the present state of affairs, but profoundly looked at would probably reveal something different. I don't hear you, I'm sorry. No.
Can you name one work that you feel deserves to, in Ukrainian, not in Russian, but in Ukrainian, that you think deserves to be part of the world canon?
I must confess that I don't know this literature, but there were some romantic Ukrainian poets. I read some time ago, I read poems by these poets translated into Polish, but I cannot now recall the name.
That's it. The world is going away. Thank you very much, Professor Krysinski.